A fresh round of trade negotiations between the United States and China is set to begin this week, aimed at diffusing what Washington describes as a dangerous escalation in economic rivalry. On the US side, Scott Bessent, the 79th US Secretary of the Treasury, will lead discussions and meet with his Chinese counterpart ahead of a possible summit between Donald J. Trump and Xi Jinping. Bessent assumed office on 28 January 2025. Xi Jinping holds the posts of President of China, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission, making him the ruling power in Beijing. Trump, now serving his second non-consecutive term as 47th President of the United States, began this term on the 20th of January 2025. In his remarks ahead of the talks, President Trump said, "We're going to meet in a couple of weeks. We're going to meet in South Korea, actually with President Ivny and other people too, but we're going to meet. I think we're going to do fine with China. I get along great with him. He's a very strong leader, very, amazing man. You look at what he's done and what he's, where his life is an amazing story. It's a story for a great movie. I think we're going to be fine with China, but we have to have a fair deal. It's got to be fair." This tone of reassurance reflects the delicate balance Washington hopes to strike, signaling readiness to engage, but also emphasizing that the US demands a fair deal. As the two economic powers prepare to sit down, analysts say the stakes could not be higher. Officials note that the trade environment between the US and China has drifted from competitive to potentially adversarial, with critical points of leverage emerging, especially around rare earth minerals, export controls, and supply chains. For instance, a recent analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, estimates that China controls roughly 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity and about 2/3 of global mining for those materials. That dominance places the US and others at a potential disadvantage when it comes to critical technologies and defense supply lines. Given China's dominant position in these critical minerals, the upcoming negotiations are viewed as much about strategic leverage as they are about tariffs and trade volumes. Although the public message centers on diplomacy and dialogue, insiders say both sides are operating in very different policy realities and that the window for de-escalation is narrow. According to one China trade specialist at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School, things are incredibly uncertain right now, despite the outward calm. On the Chinese side, Beijing has rolled out new export controls on rare earth elements and their derived technologies. On the US side, Washington has introduced sweeping export control actions targeting not just Chinese firms, but dozens of thousands of them. One of the central questions, did China escalate simply because of external pressure, or was the move part of a strategic pivot away from US-centric ties? From Washington's vantage point, China's rare earth controls are seen as a deliberate escalation. Any product made anywhere in the world that uses trace amounts of those materials now requires a license from China. From Beijing's perspective, the restrictions are framed as a response to what China claims is the US breaking prior understandings or agreements, especially in the technology and export control space. With both sides living in these different realities of blame, walking back from the brink appears significantly more difficult than the simple announcement of some talks. One of the most pressing issues for US national security planners is the extent to which China's controls could affect not just defense firms, but broader supply chains, electric vehicles, lithium battery manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and other high-tech sectors. As the Yale Law School expert notes, these rare earth materials are potentially going to disrupt the global auto supply chains, for example, electric vehicles. They've announced new controls on lithium batteries, which are part of the core of any electric vehicle made anywhere in the world. And they're also saying they're going to target new AI applications. So it's potentially much broader than the defense industry's. Beijing, however, has offered some assurances that it will issue licenses rather than impose blanket bans, suggesting it wants to maintain flexibility and preserve leverage without causing a full-scale supply chain breakdown. At the same time, the US appears to be building its own counters. accelerating efforts to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earths, stockpiling critical minerals, and aligning with allies whose resources can fill the gap. The next phase of the diplomacy is unfolding quickly. Secretary Bessent will engage with Chinese economic officials this week. Reports suggest that a meeting is planned in Malaysia for an encounter with the Chinese vice premier. At the same time, President Trump looks ahead to what could be his first in-person summit of this second term with President Xi, likely coinciding with the next Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC summit in South Korea. Trump's remarks about meeting in South Korea with Xi and other people too underscores the multilateral dimension of the upcoming talks. Yet analysts caution that even as the calendar moves forward, the underlying glue holding negotiations together remains slender. Ahead of the Malaysia meeting and the potential Trump-Xi summit, President Trump laid out demands for China that go beyond the usual tariff talk. According to recent reporting, the US is putting rare earth access, the flow of fentanyl, and soybean imports firmly on the table. In particular, he said the US wanted China to stop playing the rare earth game with us. That remark comes as China's export of rare earth magnets fell 6.1% in September 2025 compared to August, raising fresh concern in Washington that China is using its dominance as an economic weapon. Washington has also stated its expectation that China supply more US-bound soybeans and manage the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals that transit through Chinese territory. These demands reflect a broader shift. Trade talks are no longer just about access and tariffs, but about raw materials, supply chains, and strategic dependencies. Beijing's posture is more calibrated. While the export controls are broad and de facto represent an escalation, China is publicly emphasizing that it does not intend to sever all supply to the US. Rather, it is maintaining leverage. One recent analysis observed that China's strategy mirrors earlier US policy tools, extending extraterritorial export controls, blacklisting firms, and regulating technologies beyond its borders. Beijing, in its official communications, maintains that any restrictions are procedural and targeted and insists the US must step back from its aggressive tariff threat. Indeed, China has called on the US to retract a newly floated 100% tariff on Chinese goods. The risk for both sides is clear. A breakdown in talks could trigger a deeper escalation of economic conflict. For the US, failure to secure access to critical minerals or preserve its defense industrial base could have long-term consequences. For China, mismanaging export controls risks giving the US and its allies a strong incentive to expedite alternative supply chains, invest in rare earth mining outside China, and reduce Beijing's global leverage. Analysts describe the current phase as round 3 of the US-China economic war. Following earlier rounds focused on tariffs and tech exports, this one is centered on supply chains and critical minerals dominance. One way or another, the next few weeks, starting with the Malaysia engagement and leading into the Trump-Xi summit, are likely to prove pivotal. Several key pieces will determine how the negotiation unfolds, whether China issues export licenses broadly or imposes hard bans, whether the US lowers its bilateral tariffs threat in exchange for quantifiable commitments from China, the outcome of the Malaysia meeting, and whether it yields a clear framework, the summit between Trump and Xi, whether it results in a deal, deferment, or launch of high-stakes brinkmanship, external signals from allies in critical minerals and technology clusters, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. Domestic political backdrops in both countries, shutdowns, election cycles, and public opinion all bear on negotiating flexibility. As the US and China reopen the trade negotiation channel this week, what is unfolding is more than a classic tariff dispute. It is a strategic confrontation over supply chains, dominance in vital materials, and the rules of global commerce for the next decade. President Trump's assurance that we're going to be fine with China, but we have to have a fair deal, sets the tone of cautious optimism, but also underscores the red line the US is drawing. On the other side, Beijing's combination of firm export controls and flexibility-forward rhetoric reflects a leadership that believes it has the cards, but wants to play them on its terms. Whether diplomacy can absorb the tensions of rare earth dominance tech export wars and geopolitical rivalry remains an open question. The next round of talks may decide whether we move toward détente or deeper escalation.